At exactly 4:15 a.m., the prison went silent, not the ordinary silence of sleeping men behind bars, but a heavy and natural quiet where even breathing seemed dangerous. A silence so complete it felt engineered. Because inside this place the most feared gangs in the Americas had just lost everything at once: their hierarchy, their symbols, their chains of command, their voice, and their power. Under blinding white floodlights, thousands of men stood barefoot and shaved, wrists bound, eyes lowered, surrounded by armed soldiers who did not negotiate, did not threaten, and did not speak more than necessary. This was not a normal prison, and this was not a normal transfer. This was CECOT, the Center for Terrorism Confinement, a mega prison designed for one purpose only: to end gang rule without killing a single inmate. For decades, gangs had turned prisons into headquarters, places where orders were given, money was collected, and murders were planned. But here, in this moment, something unprecedented was happening. The gangs were quiet, and fear had changed sides. To understand why this prison exists, you have to understand what El Salvador became before it was built. For years the country lived under invisible borders controlled by MS-13 and Barrio 18, where crossing the wrong street could mean death, where businesses paid extortion as a form of rent, where buses were burned to send messages, and where police officers sometimes asked permission before entering neighborhoods they technically governed. The gangs didn't just control crime, they controlled daily life. And when their members were arrested, prison only made them stronger. Inside traditional prisons, gang leaders lived comfortably, communicated freely with the outside, ordered hits, and enforced loyalty. Prison wasn't a punishment, it was a promotion. That illusion of untouchable power shattered in March 2022 when a single weekend left more than 80 civilians dead, their bodies scattered across streets and sidewalks in a coordinated wave of terror meant to remind the country who truly ruled. This time, the government didn't negotiate, didn't pause, and didn't promise reform. It declared a state of exception, suspended certain rights, and began mass arrests on a scale never seen before. Tens of thousands were detained, cells overflowed, and the old prison system collapsed under the weight of numbers it was never designed to hold. Behind closed doors, a decision was made that would permanently change the balance of power. A prison so controlled, so isolated, and so absolute that gangs would never rule from inside again. CECOT rose quickly in a remote zone far from cities, surrounded by open land and military checkpoints, its design intentionally brutal and stripped of anything resembling normal life. There would be no recreation yards, no personal belongings, no murals, no mirrors, and no privacy. Cells would hold dozens of inmates at once, metal bunks stacked tightly, concrete floors cold and bare, lights never fully off. Guards would be soldiers, heavily armed, constantly rotated, forbidden from building familiarity with inmates, operating under a strict doctrine of zero negotiation and zero tolerance for corruption. But the most radical decision was this: rival gangs would not be separated. MS-13, Barrio 18, and splinter groups would be mixed together, destroying territorial control and eliminating leadership structures overnight. The system was based on a simple truth: gangs only function when hierarchy exists, and if hierarchy disappears, the gang collapses from within. When the first mass transfer arrived before dawn, buses rolled in under military escort, doors opened, and inmates were pulled out one by one, heads shaved, tattoos covered, symbols erased, stripped of anything that marked rank or reputation. There were no speeches, no explanations, no warnings, just orders and movement. Cameras captured something few Salvadorans had ever seen: men known for extreme violence avoiding eye contact, standing silently, understanding immediately that this place followed different rules. Inside CECOT, life reduced itself to repetition: wake up, stand for count, sit, eat, sleep. No phone calls, no visits, no messages to the outside world, no way to assert influence. Days blended into weeks, and something unexpected happened almost immediately. Violence didn't rise, it vanished. Not because the men had changed, but because violence requires coordination. And coordination was impossible. No inmate knew who might be watching, who could be moved without warning, or who would disappear from a cell overnight. Leadership didn't die through executions or beatings, it died through irrelevance. Former enforcers later described it simply, on the streets, fear worked for us. But in CECOT, fear works against us. The prison didn't torture inmates or beat them into submission. It did something far more effective. It removed identity. No colors, no titles, no audience. No respect to earn or demand. The prison didn't ask for confessions or remorse, it waited, and waiting became its own punishment for men who had lived fast, loud, and violent lives. Some inmates stopped speaking entirely. Others prayed constantly, and many stared at the walls for hours, forced for the first time to sit alone with memories they had spent years running from. This was the moment the real cracks began to form, not in concrete or steel, but in the minds of men who had built their entire existence on power they no longer possessed. As weeks turned into months, something deeper began to surface inside CECOT, something no blueprint or security protocol had predicted. Without the noise of gang chants, without orders shouted down corridors, without the constant validation of fear from others, time slowed to a crawl. Men who once measured life in territory gained and enemies eliminated were now measuring it in meal counts and head counts. And that kind of time does something dangerous. It forces reflection. Psychologists who later reviewed behavior patterns noticed a strange phenomenon. Inmates who had survived years of street warfare were breaking down in a place where no one touched them. Panic attacks became common. Sleeplessness spread cell to cell. Some inmates reported hearing voices late at night, not from others, but from their own memories replaying moments they had buried under violence. The prison administration didn't intervene. They observed, because CECOT wasn't designed to crush bodies. It was designed to dismantle identities. And identity loss hurts in ways physical punishment never could. One former gang lieutenant, a man whose name had once been whispered with fear in multiple neighborhoods, was observed sitting motionless 4 hours every day, eyes fixed on the same patch of concrete. Guards initially assumed he was plotting something. Wasn't. When later questioned during a routine evaluation, he reportedly said the same sentence over and over: out there, I mattered. In here, I don't exist. That was the hidden weapon of CECOT. In traditional prisons, reputation keeps you alive. Here, reputation meant nothing. No one cared who you used to be. The system treated everyone exactly the same, and that equality, for men who thrived on dominance, was unbearable. Rumors began to spread quietly among inmates, not through whispers but through glances and posture. Some men stopped standing tall during counts. Others no longer rushed to food distribution. A few refused to eat altogether. Suicide attempts, though officially unacknowledged, became an unspoken concern. Not because conditions were physically inhumane, but because the psychological vacuum was complete. There was nothing to fight for, nothing to control, and no one to impress. Even rivalries lost meaning. When enemies are stripped of symbols and power, hatred fades into exhaustion. Outside the prison walls, the country was changing just as dramatically. Streets that once emptied at sunset stayed alive late into the night. Businesses reopened without paying extortion. Parents let their children walk to school without escort. Homicide rates dropped at a speed that stunned international observers. For the first time in a generation, fear loosened its grip on daily life. The government pointed to CECOT as proof that absolute control could succeed where negotiation and reform had failed. Critics raised concerns about due process and long-term consequences. But for many citizens, those arguments felt distant compared to the immediate relief of safety. For them, the prison wasn't a symbol of oppression, it was a shield. But inside CECOT, a quieter transformation was unfolding, one that would complicate the narrative entirely. Some inmates began to change in ways no one expected, without gang pressure, without the constant need to prove loyalty. A small number started showing signs of regret, not the performative kind meant to reduce sentences, but something raw and unfiltered. Men who had joined gangs as teenagers began talking about moments before initiation, about choices that felt inevitable at the time but now seemed absurdly small compared to the consequences. These conversations weren't organized. They weren't encouraged. They happened accidentally. Between strangers forced into proximity by design, One night, during a routine count, guards noticed something unusual. A group of inmates was sitting in complete silence, not staring at the walls, not sleeping, but facing inward toward one another. No gestures, no whispers, just presence. Intelligence officers reviewed footage repeatedly, expecting to find coded communication or early signs of organization. They found none. What they were seeing was something far more unsettling and far more human. Men who had spent their lives surrounded by noise were learning how to exist without it. And that raised a dangerous question, one the prison's architects hadn't fully answered. If you strip away power long enough, do you destroy the gang forever, or do you create something unpredictable in its place? Because power doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it transforms. As months passed, subtle hierarchies began forming, not based on violence or reputation, but on resilience. Men who could endure the emptiness without breaking became quietly influential. Not leaders in the old sense, but anchors. Others gravitated toward them, not out of fear, but out of desperation for meaning. The administration noticed the shift and responded immediately, rotating cells, separating groups, disrupting even the faintest pattern. Control had to remain absolute. There could be no center, no gravity, no structure at all. Then came the incident no official report fully explains. One morning, during a standard transfer between cell blocks, an inmate collapsed without warning. No assault, no visible injury, just sudden failure. Medical teams responded quickly, but the damage was already done. Later analysis suggested extreme psychological stress compounded by prolonged emotional suppression. Word spread fast inside the prison, not as panic, but as realization. This place could break you without ever touching you, and that knowledge changed everything. Compliance deepened, resistance evaporated. Men who once defied death now feared something far quieter, disappearing internally before their sentence ever ended. CECOT had succeeded beyond expectations, but success carried a shadow. International observers began questioning what happens to men who leave a place like this, if they ever do. Can someone who has been reduced to nothing rebuild an identity without violence? Or does emptiness create a hunger that eventually seeks power again? The prison had ended gang rule, but it had also rewritten the psychology of incarceration. It wasn't just holding criminals. It was reshaping human behavior under extreme control. And buried beneath the statistics, beneath the political praise and criticism, was a truth you wanted to confront. The gangs hadn't been defeated by force. They had been defeated by silence, by routine, by the slow erasure of meaning. But silence is never permanent. And the question that lingered, unanswered and uncomfortable, was what would happen when some of these men eventually stepped back into the world, no longer gang members, no longer leaders, but carrying the memory of a place that proved absolute power doesn't need brutality to be effective. It only needs time. When the first rumors of release began circulating outside the prison, they didn't come from officials or press conferences. They came from lawyers, from families waiting in silence, and from a handful of court documents that quietly confirmed what many believed would never happen. Not every man inside CECOT would stay there forever. Some sentences were finite, some cases were still moving through the system, and for the first time since the prison opened, the country had to confront a reality it had avoided. CECOT was incredibly effective at taking power away, but it had never been designed to give anything back. Inside the prison, inmates sensed the shift before it was ever acknowledged. Guards became more alert during transfers. Psychological evaluations increased. Cell rotations happened more frequently. The administration wasn't afraid of riots or organized violence. That threat was gone, but they were afraid of something harder to control: adaptation. Men were learning how to survive the silence. Not all of them were breaking. Some were hardening in a new way, quieter, more internal, more patient. These were not the impulsive street soldiers of the past. These were men who had learned how to wait without hope and without collapse. One former inmate would later describe it chillingly: on the streets, power was loud. In CECOT, power is endurance. That sentence never appeared in an official report, but it spread among analysts like a warning, because endurance is not the same as reform. Endurance can coexist with resentment, with calculation, with delayed intention. The prison had destroyed gang structures, but it had also produced men who understood systems better than ever before. They had watched how authority moved, how routines worked, how control was enforced without emotion. They had lived inside a machine, and machines can be studied. Then came the case that forced the government to confront the unintended consequences of its own success. A man arrested early during the mass crackdown, a low-level affiliate with no violent convictions, was released after nearly 2 years. There was no ceremony, no press. He stepped out thinner, quieter, and visibly older than his age. Journalists later asked him what CECOT was like. He didn't speak about guards or cells. He said only this: "You stop thinking about tomorrow. That's how you survive." The comment unsettled psychologists more than any accusation of abuse ever could, because the absence of future-oriented thinking is not rehabilitation, it's psychological suspension. What happened next didn't make headlines, but it rippled through policy circles. That man didn't return to gang life. He didn't commit a crime. He didn't celebrate freedom. He isolated himself completely. Family members reported emotional flatness, long periods of silence, and an inability to make even simple decisions. He had survived the prison, but he had left something essential behind, and he wasn't alone. Similar reports followed quietly, forming a pattern no one wanted to publicize. CECOT was incredibly effective at neutralizing violence, but it was also creating men who no longer knew how to exist without total control imposed on them. Supporters argued this was a small price to pay. Crime had collapsed. Lives had been saved. Entire generations were growing up without the constant threat of gang violence. But critics began asking a different question, one that struck at the heart of justice itself. If a prison removes identity completely, does release become a second punishment? And if so, where does accountability end and responsibility begin? The state had succeeded in doing what gangs once did, reshaping human behavior through fear and routine. The difference was intention, not impact. Inside CECOT, the remaining inmates felt the shift too. Those who had once feared endless confinement now faced a more complex terror, the possibility of freedom, because freedom meant rebuilding a self from nothing, and not everyone wanted that. Some inmates began committing minor infractions deliberately, just enough to delay evaluations, just enough to remain inside a structure that, while oppressive, was familiar. Guards noticed it. Psychologists documented it. The prison had become, for some, the only place where life made sense. This was the twist no one expected. The mega prison designed to end gang power had succeeded so completely that it raised a final, haunting question: what happens when control works too well? CECOT proved that gangs don't need bullets to be defeated. They need irrelevance. They need silence. They need time. But it also proved something far more uncomfortable: that absolute control can stabilize a society while quietly hollowing out the individual's identity contains. Today, the prison still stands, massive and impenetrable, a symbol of safety for millions and a warning for anyone tempted by gang life. Murals are painted outside its walls celebrating peace. Politicians point to it as proof that order can be restored. And statistically, they are right. But inside those walls, men continue to wake up, stand for count, sit, eat, and sleep under lights that never fully go out, carrying a lesson burned deep into their minds. Power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and erases. CECOT didn't just end gang rule. It changed the definition of punishment. And long after the bars rust and the walls crack, the real legacy of this prison won't be measured in crime rates or arrest numbers. It will be measured in what happens when men who were stripped of everything are asked to return to a world that no longer fears them and no longer knows what they've become.